This is Women in Linux. Welcome to the Women in Linux podcast, exposing women to information and careers in technology.
Thanks for joining Women in Linux with your hosts Tamika Reed and Dee Parler. Today we have technical course trainer and grand poobah of Kubernetes, Tim Serewicz. Tim.
Hi there. Welcome. Thank you for that intro.
Welcome.
I told you.
Yeah, we met at the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit. We were all sitting out watching the animals do their thing for that day. Yeah. And so we got to talking, and I was telling you about me taking the exam class that you wrote. I think it's LFS 258 or maybe LF 258.
LFS 258. Yep.
258. We were talking about the different classes that are out there to get spun up on in terms of Kubernetes and some future of Kubernetes. So when creating this class, what was your background to saying, hey, I'm going to create this class? And then two, how did you study up the material? Because it's a lot of material to create it. And were you the only person that did it, or did you work with other people to create the content?
Well, it's as far as starting from the beginning, a lot of the reason that I was given this opportunity to write the class was my experience with OpenStack. OpenStack, as another open source project, fast moving, a lot of change, and a large community that had a lot of similarities to Kubernetes. So when it became obvious that the Linux Foundation needed content for Kubernetes, I was asked to do some work on it. As far as how to learn it, it has been an interesting journey. I've learned the hard way, so to speak, and what that means is there isn't a lot of good documentation or examples. So I had to basically install it and try to get stuff done. When it didn't work, try to figure it out, and then write down all my experiences. To some extent, that's actually a really good way to learn, because unlike somebody who already knows everything that tries to explain it later, they miss stuff. They have assumptions and background knowledge they didn't have before. Whereas with this course, I was able to approach it as hopefully as every other student does, where they know Linux, they know something about working in IT, but not the particulars of this product. So it was all at the tips of the fingers that I learned the product, and it is it's actually kind of unique in the open source world because of the companies that are getting into it and trying to monetize Kubernetes. OpenStack was kind of a unknown factor until it became powerful and useful. And as a result, a lot of the big organizations saw, hey, this is good. We can make use of the technology, but we're not going to monetize it directly. There was a lot of people, I think, felt that they missed the opportunity. So when Kubernetes became big, they said, let's not just use it, let's monetize it. Well, if you're trying to sell services and documentation, there's not a profit motive to write good documentation for the public. So unlike other open source projects, I've noticed that the data that you can get readily is not nearly as high quality. And the type of person who would normally write good docs or help messages or on the forums, it seems has been encouraged to perhaps take that and keep that data in-house. And if you pay for a service, you can get access to our knowledge base. So it has been an uphill journey learning Kubernetes for that reason. And I didn't have a lot of necessarily good sources for it. One of the things I did have was I have some people that I've met through being in the industry for a while that were more knowledgeable, and they would allow me to ask questions. So one of the things I always tell people for learning Kubernetes is the documentation is probably never going to be your first and best source. It's going to be somebody you know. So make those relationships, as we met at the summit, the people that you meet at the summit, get their card, reach out to them. That's probably where you're going to get accurate Kubernetes information.
I agree. I was on mute trying to get myself off. So, would you saying that it kind of brought up another point of what I was looking at when trying to teach people Linux. One of the big things is that there's a lot of content out there in this case, and there's a lot of people to lean on, but to get started in it, say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there wasn't a Linux Academy. It was just a book, some computers, and possibly somebody you may have met along the way to ask questions and bounce off of. And still, I guess you can call that paired learning or paired programming. That has been how I learned some, but most of the time it was just what you were doing. It was trial and error and trying to figure it out. With that being said, do you find yourself, especially since you have to go out and pull in information, do you find yourself writing a lot of notes or typing a lot of notes and taking screenshots and making your own, book of information as you continue on your journey of like things change, a new operator comes out, this is not how you use Helm, you have to use Helm this way, or use a pod this way, or what have you? Do you find yourself rewriting documentation that you had before?
Yes, especially with Kubernetes. The amount of change that happens is intense. And with a major release every 3 months, sprints in between, there is a lot of change. My own method for writing this course was I found all the documentation I could, and as you mentioned, I basically started to write my own copy-paste. And unfortunately, what I found was I copied it, I pasted it, and I tried to make sense of what I found. Like, oh, that's a good paragraph, and copy-paste, just for kind of a reading list of my own, trying to find the nuggets. What I found, though, is when I went to actually use that information, read it for content and comprehension, and then said, oh, well, this is how it works. And I tried actually doing it. It was not accurate. And that's something that I want to warn people about with Kubernetes. There is information that's either no longer accurate or it never was accurate. And people ask me, why in the world would there be false information? Well, it's not actually malicious, but one of the things that happened was these websites were built to get content out there, and then they were made to look very beautiful by a very qualified team. OpenStack documentation still sort of looks bad. It doesn't look polished at all, but you can kind of get a feel for what's probably accurate and what's probably just somebody's guess. Unfortunately, in the Kubernetes world, it's all been made to look pretty, and it all looks very polished. You don't know what's real or what's a blueprint. So I've been finding documentation that says this is how a part works. Oh, great, let me do that. It doesn't work that way. 2-3 days later, lots of effort, I send an email. I can't get this to work. And the reply comes back very quickly. Oh, that never worked. We hoped it would work, but nobody's ever gotten that to work. So, that's happened to me several times. So I actually start to look at it saying, why is it that there's at first, of course, my assumption is somebody's out to waste my day. And I looked into it, and strangely enough, nobody actually gives thought to me. It's that somebody had the job of writing content. And so they went through architecture documents, blueprints, meetups. They took what people said and then made it a document that is not necessarily true or never will be true.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It was more along the lines like this could be a proof of concept, but we didn't implement this. And there was probably a lot of moving parts just to get it implemented. But then somebody documented it and hope someone would pick it up and try to make it work. Or join the mission to make it work. Almost like a white paper, I guess.
Right. So you had somebody writing the actual document from a white paper, and that white paper was made from a meetup. But with 2 or 3 iterations, now it looks like this is the way something works, because you had a skilled technical writer put it together, but they never tested it. They just assumed that whoever handed it to them did it. So it's like the telephone game, like I whisper something to the first person and they whisper to the second. Well, it's like that with nobody ever checking the details. And if you add that and then changing a lot of things every 3 months, the available resources and their quality, it for one, it just doesn't keep up, but also it may never have been accurate in the first place.
Right.
How frustrating for people trying to learn a new technology.
It absolutely is. Yes. And believe me, I've lived through that frustration, and I continue to, because I constantly update this course. So every week I'm finding stuff that's broken and fixed and trying to figure out what happened. And sometimes it's a bug. And so I changed the course to make sure that the bug is understood, but I didn't realize it was a bug because nobody knew it was a bug. I thought it was a feature. And then, so, update 2 comes out and the bug's gone. That quote unquote feature is gone. And I'm like, well, what happened? Oh, it wasn't supposed to do that. Great. Thanks for telling me. So then you have to undo half of it and redo something else. So with thousands of people working independently, it's like you're herding cats, but you're herding cats in 40 locations simultaneously.
Right. Which was another point in your class and currently what you do in setting up your environment. Oftentimes, so I am, I guess you can call me a gadget geek, but I'm also a cloud geek too. So I try different things in different clouds. So my bills are normally high. So in terms of like setting up Minikube or setting up AWS or setting up GCP or setting up, what's the other one? GCP, DigitalOcean now. You have a variety of locations where you can build out a cluster. You can also build it out with Minikube on your laptop. What I found when I was studying for the exam is me going to all those different locations helped me on the exam. And I'm not saying anybody who's listening to this podcast, that's the best thing to do because your bill can be high. However, what I did discover was there are different ways to do different things. Like, for example, I've been using GitLab to deploy my Kubernetes cluster out to Google Cloud. And then checking in my code into GitLab and having my pods or my replica sets or my daemon sets run on my cluster out in GCP, but I'm checking it in a GitLab. So, learning about CI/CD with Kubernetes and how does that work? And then taking those concepts and then trying to apply and study that with, not just for a job, but study that and understand that for the class. And I know you talked about when we were in Vancouver, we were talking about what you should do to set yourself up to study. So give us a good solution for someone to set up themselves to study, or an example of what you use or how you set yourself up to study, especially since you have to change your courses every time something happens or every 3 months. What's a good working setup?
Well, actually, what you explained is a perfect setup. So to try to reproduce a production environment as close as possible, which is the deployment of pods with different controllers and watch loops, keeping track of them and moving your code around and deploying it in different arenas, whether it's Google or Microsoft or your own bare metal. The exam itself, for those of the people who are interested in becoming certified, if you go and go to cncf.io, look up certification, you'll find that there is a list of what they call domains. And these are what a committee of folks has said somebody should know. And there's a whole series of bullet points, 40 or 50 of them. And if you look at the table of contents of the courses I write, they are pretty close to one another. So I use those as well because that's what leaders in the industry have said people should know. What I would encourage somebody to do to learn it and or become certified is get that list of domains and print it out. Underneath each bullet point, write out the particular steps to do it. That will give you a good framework of, somebody who works with this product should know this sort of stuff. Then try to actually get it done. Every time that you deploy those same things in a different environment. So let's just say that I start with Google Compute Environment. Okay, I get it to work. And then I realize, well, I'd like to do it on Amazon. Well, it's not going to be a one-to-one move. You're going to have to do stuff differently. You will learn so much when all your stuff breaks. So you'll say like, okay, this used to work. Why doesn't it? And you'll see the inner workings that aren't obvious between the various objects, and you realize I didn't open up all my ports. I thought it was just TCP, and here's some UDP traffic. Or I didn't know this other port was in use, and now I understand why it was there, because this traffic stopped working. So by going through those iterations as many times as possible, with as many tools as possible as well, not only just the provider, the cloud provider, but also we focus on kubeadm because that's what the community has gotten behind. But there's probably 10 or 20 other startup companies that have their own scripts. Look at their stuff and see if you can implement it. And does it work? Why doesn't it work? That's what you end up doing in production is, okay, I tried to get it to work and it didn't. Now let me figure out why. So doing it on your own is probably the best way for deep and long-term retention. It's going to be the most work, though.
Right. What about setting up 3 bare metal machines out at packet.net? Would you recommend that?
What I would do is I'd probably start with as simple a deployment as possible. The Minikube is a very easy way to get Kubernetes running. The biggest headache to that is that it's a single node. And as a result, you don't get to see networking and movement issues and evacuation and a lot of the higher functions that an admin would probably have to tackle on a regular basis. So starting with 2 VMs on VirtualBox, I'm actually putting together a how-to video for the Linux Foundation on how to get VirtualBox running so that, assuming you have enough memory on your laptop, you could do it all by yourself. So, I have a video out there for setting up our environments on AWS and another one on GCE so that people you don't have to figure out the cloud side of it. You can focus on the Kubernetes side of it. So the Linux Foundation, we have 2 and going to have 3 videos to do that. But I would do those things and go through the iteration of a multi-node setup. So it doesn't matter if it's bare metal, Amazon, Google, whichever, VirtualBox, VMware, just have 2 so that you can see the networking part, because networking and Kubernetes, it's kind of the same word, really. It's so network dependent that if you only have one instance, you're missing so much. So whatever choice you make, I would really encourage people to start with at least 2 instances so that you can see that side of it.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
One of the biggest things that I see is some people are not putting everything in the cloud. They're trying to deploy Kubernetes on-prem. So using things like Nomad or from HashiCorp or just Kubernetes itself. The one biggest difference I can say between Kubernetes and OpenStack is you don't have with OpenStack, you kind of got about 20 different flavors under OpenStack, O, and then something else, and then something else, and then something else. I haven't seen that yet, per se, under Kubernetes. I've seen people roll Kubernetes and put an interface or something on top of it or add a feature to it, but I haven't seen the baseline of Kubernetes look like OpenStack. Is that a correct assumption?
Oh, yeah. And this gets to a previous idea of the IT companies are trying to monetize Kubernetes. And so they don't want you to have a independent, flexible thing when they could instead give you an installer tool that has a nice long tail to it. You're kind of using their stuff. You're kind of stuck with them, whoever them is. I'm not trying to pick on any particular company. It's just I've noticed the same, that unlike OpenStack, where you had 10 different ways of doing it, and you could make your own very easily, that instead, it seems that vendors are providing a kind of lockdown tool, an appliance, saying, just use this, don't worry about the details. And that's an easy way to do it, but you also don't have knowledge past their tool set.
Right. And with the state of Kubernetes changing every 3 months, where do you think it's headed? Because I see now It's an alpha release from Google. They have the GKE coming out for on-prem use or whatever use. Let's just not say on-prem. You can deploy it wherever. Where do you see Kubernetes headed? Because a lot of people are saying like this is going to be the new OS. As it keeps changing every 3 months, what are your thoughts?
I think it's going to get a lot more towards that. The missing part that has been holding Kubernetes back from being a larger, more widely used tool has been the integration to everything else in an environment. So service mesh technology, and a service mesh is effectively leveraging a series of proxies to communicate about traffic, resource discovery, load balancing, a lot of the how do I get to my application stuff is what service meshes do. A lot of people have heard of Istio. That's a very common one. That's a service mesh. So with that becoming useful, and Envoy is a great proxy. I'm writing a course for the Linux Foundation currently on Envoy, how to deploy and work with Envoy, and we'll also do Linkerd and Istio as well. But that's what a lot of businesses have been missing is, okay, great, we have Kubernetes. What do I do with it? How do I use it? The service mesh that will allow that layer to be accessed is going to allow companies to now really integrate it. And when you can integrate a large collection of commodity hardware and you're not tied to any of it, that's a real advantage. So from a business standpoint, if I don't like vendor A, or I can get a slightly better deal from vendor B for my hardware, whether it's networking hardware or compute, anything, that's an advantage. And that flexibility, I often use the term Legos, that it's like dumping out a box of 500 Legos. You can build whatever you want. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And that's the downside as well, is unlike a single vendor product where, like a model airplane, where you know what you're ending up with, you don't necessarily know with Kubernetes. You could deploy it and not have it work.
Exactly. And now you got to troubleshoot.
Right.
And get that going, which is another question was, what's a good starting point for someone? What's their list of skills they need to have? I have networking, DNS, Linux, and security. And as I'm speaking on security from the security of the containers, security of the cluster itself, also security of just understanding security overall, and networking, you can throw networking in there for, how to secure the networks within Kubernetes. And then also understanding what does it mean to be cloud native, or the things that I came up with technical wise. I'm sure there's some soft skills in there that could be thrown in there, but is there anything else that I could be missing that you can think of?
No, I think that's a good list for that. Troubleshooting, and this is something that I preach a lot, is something that only is effective if you understand. I always draw a pyramid. The lower section of the pyramid is what do we have? The middle section of the pyramid is how is it configured? If you really understand what is in your data center, and then you really understand how it's been configured, only then can you really do troubleshooting and or performance and tuning, because you're just kind of guessing otherwise. With Kubernetes, what we're doing is we're taking all the stuff that used to be in a data center, and then we're decoupling it. We're saying nothing should touch anything permanently, and we're making it transient. I should be able to kill anything at any time and have everything else live. That's how you know you're actually ready. Ready for production is probably a little bit overstating it, but what I tell companies when I go in and I'm talking to them is, can I let loose Chaos Monkey? And to explain Chaos Monkey for some people, it just kills containers randomly, and you don't know which one. Could be any one of them. Mm-hmm. Can you let it loose? And does your customer notice? That's what I always ask them. And almost every place I've been, I have a mix of management and technical. The manager's like, yeah, we're ready. We're ready. Everything's, it's cloud native. We're ready. And I look around the room, and the technical people, their eyes are saying, we're not ready. And so I'll bring it up in as a polite way as I can. Oh, really? Okay. So can I kill any application? And I'll look over and kind of pick on the guy who knows the truth. It's like, well, as long as they don't, kill this or this container, we're fine. And you can see the mood change around the room as people realize, oh, I never really understood what you meant when you were telling me this. They don't understand that to be truly ready, your applications, all the stuff the company does, you have to be able to lose that data center, that server, that rack, that row, or all of these apps, and have it recover such that the customer really doesn't notice. That's how you're ready. That's how you know you're there. And that's when you know troubleshooting is when you can get to that point, and if it doesn't work, you know why.
So that's a good question. So when you're building out your environment, do you release Chaos Monkey for your lab environment just to see if it actually works?
Well, luckily with my typing skills, I am my own Chaos Monkey. What I do is, because Chaos Monkey does take a little bit of time and effort to deploy, and my environments don't last that long. But how I found to check my own work is I will try, and this can help as you study as well, is I try to do the task as fast as I possibly can. So most people, when they study and they learn, it's a slow process. There's a window principle that you only learn a little bit more than what you already know, and that's normal. That's human nature. But what happens is how you learned it is how you use it. So if you learned it at a very slow, deliberate pace, you tend to use it that way. Mm-hmm. But by going through my labs or whatever it is, I will actually sit down and from a blank slate, I will see how fast I can get someplace. And I make all sorts of mistakes. Well, those mistakes are the common issues that people make, that it happens. And I'm causing it to happen by that haste, that I'm trying to cause those problems. And what happens is I get to the end and I realize it didn't work. And you try to step back and say, well, where did I go wrong? Why is it that I got off track? And I try to find those points. And that will tell you a lot about what you didn't know as well as you thought you did.
Now, with everything coming out, have you played with Nomad at all yet?
Only enough to see what it was. So I haven't, right? Because everybody's talking about this tool or that tool. It's like, oh, tell me more. And like many deployment tools, there's some good things and some stuff that wouldn't necessarily work for me.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
Now, with the buy of Heptio with VMware and the whole move, I think we're already at the hybrid cloud stage. I actually think we're at the multi-cloud stage, but we just haven't gotten a good handle on those two environments yet. How are you seeing the Heptio VMware multi-cloud spin up go? What do you think that's going to go?
Well, it seems from outside, that ever since Dell started to pick up various companies, they have EMC, VMware, and now VMware's acquired Heptio, that they're looking at becoming a provider very similar to Oracle, where they can do the full stack for you. Mm-hmm. And so I have a feeling that it won't have far-reaching effects as far as opening up new fields for everybody, that, there's another way of approaching this, or it's going to make the market more efficient as I have new tools. I have a feeling, and this is just my own vibe, is that it will become part of why, Dell's going to say, this is why you should choose us as a provider, because we can do it all, from the hardware to the application and the consulting to get you there. The services is where it's at. Global services is the margin. And I think that's why it's theirs. They were missing some of that in the cloud space. They already have the storage, they have the virtualization, and of course they have the physical compute hardware side. I think that kind of ability to offer it was missing. So sadly, I think it might kind of disappear into the homogeny of the new Dell super company.
I wonder the same thing about with Red Hat and IBM. I see both sides. The hybrid cloud, OpenShift, mainly government contracts. There's a lot of commercial work, but mainly a lot of work from government contracting under the Red Hat situation. I often wonder, I don't want to say who's going to win, who's going to be a good fit for teams to learn and get spun up on. Because a lot of what I see is, hey, we need a Kubernetes guru. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Do you need someone that really understands how to set up Kubernetes, or do you need someone that understands how to deploy an application to Kubernetes, or do you need someone to secure it, or do you need someone to do every single thing? So what does that person look like, and where do they lie? What compliance rules are you trying to adhere to? If at minimum some DoD compliance rules, but then up from that, what does that look like? And what is that skill set and that journey for that person look like as well too? So I often wonder about, like, I think now people are calling it DevX ops instead of DevSecOps or DevTestOps or whatever. How do you get your testing done? And going from there, I looked at at KubeCon, there was Chick-fil-A. And Chick-fil-A was doing GitOps with Kubernetes and Weaveworks, and they have 2,000 Kubernetes clusters. And they keep a repo for each of their machines, and they deploy from their main repo out to the different repos, and then it pushes down to the different machines whenever there's a change that needs to be made. But then, you think about the work that it took to get that set up in every one of their environments across the U.S. What does that look like? What skill sets did that person have? What networking had to be done to get that going? Trial and error is. So when I hear people say they're looking for a Kubernetes guru, I'm like, what does that person look like? And where do you, and how does one become the guru? What is that? I don't want to say resume, but what does that roadmap look like for that person to be that guru for whatever?
It is something I've seen at both the request side and the people trying to get there. What I find is that I do a fair amount of on-sites where I go to a customer and I teach them Kubernetes. And most of the places that I go have implemented it or tried to implement it, and now they're trying to bring that information to their larger population, whether it's management and or technical workers. Most of the places I've been, the successful places I've been, have a small population of really knowledgeable and gifted Kubernetes people. And they really do the heavy lifting. There's only 4 or 5 of them. And this might be for a very large organization, but and that's part of the power, is you only need a small group of highly skilled people. Then everyone else is kind of at a lower level. And that as a result, it's like a barbell, that you have a couple people at the high end, you have nobody in the middle as far as experience and knowledge, and a lot of people with very little experience and knowledge. What happens is, how do I make that leap from very little experience to a lot? And really what I would say is a good way of doing it, and what I have found from the people I talk to, because I talk to them throughout the week of how did you get here and how do you learn, is that it's when you're responsible for everything. So almost every highly skilled, highly knowledgeable person in Kubernetes had to do it all at some point. So whether it was with a startup or it was a project that their boss put them on, they didn't have help. They had to do it all, and they stuck with it. And they spent lots of nights and weekends studying, getting it to work. Most of them came with a lot of Linux knowledge already, so they didn't have to learn networking. They didn't have to learn a lot about systems or deployments, but they were trying to get something to work, and they stuck with it. That's the story of almost every kind of experienced high-end Kubernetes worker I have found, and I don't meet a lot of people in the middle.
Which brings up a good point that I go on my mad rant about, and I know people who are listening to this like, no one cares about that, but this is what I say when I looked at Kubernetes and broke it down, and just in general, people call sysadmins generalists, and saying, I think what spawned up out of system administration is infrastructure engineer, and then SRE as well, and all these other things that have pretty much have been siloed off. But if you're right, if you were the sysadmin that had to figure it out, and came from the background of having to look at everything and figure it out, that's what Kubernetes is to me all over again. It's looking at everything and having to figure it out, but I got help now. I don't
Right.
have to, I don't have to actually wait for somebody to approve me buying this machine because I'm in the cloud. That's where the cloud comes in at, or some type of overarching feature that can allow me to take commodity hardware and spin it up or what have you. But that's what I see. I see like system administration as a good foundation for understanding Kubernetes and throwing in things like containers. I think security is just a feature of system administration. I think that's a part of it, but throwing in containers and understanding how to deploy containers and write code or APIs or those are add-ons as well too. But I think under just a base as a base, I think system administration is a good base into Kubernetes. Me personally, but some others may feel that's different. But I'm saying that from the perspective of knowing every single thing, like understanding networking, VLANs, security, all those things.
Oh,
That's my mad rant.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's actually a rant we share then, because I often say the very same thing that when I have students, I do teaching, when they talk about, well, how does this affect my job? I'm in this silo. I'm the storage guy here, or I'm this guy. I really, I jump up on my soapbox and I'm like, okay, so everybody knows that the phase we're entering is we're getting rid of the silo. That you really either need to be ready to start learning all the other aspects, and you want to be as general as possible, because the whole nature of this orchestration software and the decoupling from the hardware is to get rid of the silo, that I don't need to have 5 people that are each independently knowledgeable but have no crossover. How about I have one person who can do it all? And that's an economic look. As far as having a staff of highly skilled people costs money. So if I can get away with less people and just have one, that's good from a business standpoint. And that is a driving factor I see an awful lot. That we don't need somebody that's the best possible person who knows about deploying an app, or is the best backup guy. It's okay if you're just good enough if you can do these 4 other things. So being able to expand your exposure to other fields and areas is definitely the future for a while, at least. Things tend to go in waves, but I think the age of silo is waning, and we're entering the experienced generalist phase. Unlike 20 years ago, when we had generalists as well, you could get away with being sort of knowledgeable. I don't think that middle knowledge band exists anymore. Because you have enough that you're trying to do something, but nobody will trust you to actually do it yet. And that's the unfortunate part, that it's going to be difficult, unless you're incredibly motivated, to go from the low level to the more experienced generalist. You're going to have to fight for it. It's not going to be part of a normal IT career anymore.
Yeah, what I've been seeing too is like junior is around 5 years and senior is 7 years, whereas senior used to be 10 years. So you're taking off 3 years. So if you're a beginner now, it's like 3 years. Beginners, absolutely 3 years. And then intermediate is 5 to 6, sometimes 7, and then 7 and up is senior, where it used to be 10. And it's interesting to me because I'm always looking at I'm always looking at it from a couple of different perspectives. One, how do you get the person spun up on it really quickly so they can get into the environment, so they can start playing with it and start doing it and start working in it as well too? And then how do you take the person who's been saying something, and we're not talking just Kubernetes here, we're just talking in general. Say you've been in it for 5 years, how do you pivot, and what's your next steps, and where do you go next? How do you pivot, and where are you going with your skill set? What is, how do you help somebody guide them down that path?
Sure. It's I've noticed that there is a the same kind of thing, where the amount of time to be seen as proficient or senior, it has come down a great deal. With Kubernetes in particular, I find a lot of people that are very new to IT, and by that I mean, they've been working with it for, let's say, 5 years, but are viewed and have the skills of that senior level. So in a traditional sense, if you were 5 years into IT, people would be like, no, don't touch the keyboard. You're not quite there yet. Whereas I'll go into a startup, for example, and they're kind of expert, their local resource is 7 years into IT as far as a career. Now, when you talk to them, you realize that they've been working with it since they were 10 years old. And so they really have more time working with the product and IT in general, but just not necessarily in a commercial sense. How do you get there? How do you pivot? It is, on the one hand, it's very easy because you can spin up a massive environment in Amazon today. For $10, you can have you can replicate a full production environment very easily. So on the one hand, that's there. On the other hand, there's less paths to it because, as I was saying, the kind of journeyman or the apprentice concept in IT, that middle class of knowledge class is gone, and the companies don't necessarily have a reason to build it. Some do, but most are like, we'll just find somebody. We'll find that one lady who knows really how to do it, and then we don't need to have anybody else, just her. Well, as a result, you have to kind of do it on your own. And by that, I mean, if you were to, one guy that I know, he basically, he sat down and said, how do I sell? And he made a very simple video game as an app. And he said, okay, how would I have the world play this video game? And it's the equivalent of Pong. So it's not about the game, but he started thinking about, how would I have everybody anywhere in the world play my app using this resource? And he approached it that way because it was kind of fun for him and he had friends play it and so forth. But the exposure and knowledge that he has, he actually, even though he's only a couple of years out of college, he went to a company and says, this is what I did. I made this app. You can play it anywhere in the world, and we can scale up to 100,000 users from the 20 users that are using it, and it's this easy to do. And the company was like, you're hired. You're in. You are our senior guy, because he had the skills and he could demonstrate it. That's what you need to get to, is the only way to do it is kind of expose yourself, because, unfortunately, most companies, they don't even know what they're doing, really. That's kind of a corporate secret in corporate America. They don't know what they're missing.
It's not a secret, Tim.
Okay. I'll just say that. I don't want to call too many people out, but they don't know. They don't know that they don't know. And as a result, because of the speed of transition, you really have to pursue it yourself. And like what I said, find something you like doing. Can you make it transient, decoupled, and worldwide? If you can do that, that's how I would go to my next gig and say, this is what I can do for you.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
That is something that someone told me too, is, don't focus on the small picture, focus on the big picture. Look, here's what I can do. And I'm teetering the line here of ego and arrogance, but again, let's call it grand poobah confidence. Let's say you walk in and you know that you have been working on something with GitLab to spin up a Kubernetes cluster, run through a CI/CD, make a change, do a rolling update, canary deployments or whatnot, and make a video of that. And post it on your YouTube, on your website or something, and then say, okay, this is what I can do. This is what I've been doing. And this is why I've been studying. Is my thought process. But
absolutely. Yeah. That will get you far more attention than probably any other single thing. Most managers, and especially on the first tiers, the HR departments, they don't really know what they're asking. They have a list and they say, okay, do you meet these check boxes? Okay, check. So you make sure that you start to understand what those checkboxes are, and then say that you meet them, no matter how closely you actually do, as long as you have the actual back-end skills to do it. That's the important part. So get past the gatekeeper, and then once people realize that, hey, I can turn you loose, I can give you access, and you're going to make this stuff work. Because in the long run, we really don't care how you do it. If it's magic, we don't care. We just want our stuff to work. So practice getting stuff to work, and whether it's showing it as a video or a live demonstration. So the young man that I know that did that, he did it as a live demonstration. He got past the gatekeepers, and he was in the interview, and he opened up his laptop and says, "This is what I've deployed right now, and let me emulate if I add 1,000 users." And he did, and they were actually able to see it fan out across the globe, because he had the requests coming from around the world from one provider to the other. And so when a Google compute engine in I don't know where it was, let's say France, started requesting it, a node on Amazon popped up to respond, and they got to see it live and how he rolled it out, and he did it all himself. And they were like, "You're hired. Let's get two of you. When can you start?" So he probably spent 3 or 4 months of his life doing all this. He learned it, and it got him, a very nice, high-paying job. He's the youngest person in the office because he's only 3-4 years out of college.
What do you think the salary range is for someone? Let's say I'm a freelancer and I take in the exam and I can demonstrate something. What does a starting salary look like? I have 4 years of experience, but I just passed the Kubernetes exam as an administrator, and I'm ready to do my interviews. What does that range look like? Because I've seen some crazy ranges from 200,000, 180, 200 to 500,000.
Well, if you can tell me where you found those $500,000 jobs, that would be great, because I need to make a call then. I would say that a lot of it depends on where you are in the country or in the world.
Right.
Because if I pay somebody $140,000 and they live in my office and I want them to be in my office in San Francisco, I am not going to find anybody. It's going to be very tough. So I was with a startup, and they were well-funded out in San Francisco, and basically none of their high-end people live there. They all telecommute. They all live in much cheaper areas, so that they got away with paying them, something around 200 for a highly experienced worker who could do everything, and just showed up at the office every 2-3 weeks. Everything else was online. So I think that's a big part of it, is if you're old school and you want to see somebody sitting in the chair all the time for whatever reason, that it's going to cost you a lot if you're in a tech center. If Silicon Valley, New York, those kind of places are going to cost you so much money. If you're smarter and say, work anywhere but do the job. And most of the high-end Kubernetes people, they didn't do all this effort to slack. They're going to be spending their whole day working for you. You don't have to stare at them sitting in the chair. They're going to be, they're going to work all day, all night anyways. So
right.
Why not turn them loose and just check in every week with a video conference and just let it happen? And I think that's the big effect is, if you're going to force somebody to go and live in San Francisco, it's somebody who's going to be living with 3 other people in an apartment on $140 a year. As sadly as that is, where like I live out in Texas, it's a lot cheaper here. And so if you offer somebody 140, 160, that's a reasonable wage. Like you can own a house and a car and have a life. Not that you would because you're in Kubernetes, but you could financially afford that. So I think a lot of it depends on where you live in the world, but entry level, from what I've seen in, let's say, just in general, I would say that probably if you know what you're doing, but you're still entry, is in the, let's say, 75 range. And then really after that, it's what you negotiate. If I go to my boss and I say, hey, I can replace 6 people here and I can do it all myself, I can probably argue for a $200,000 salary. Sadly for the other 4 guys, he doesn't need them anymore.
Right. And it's just crazy on some of the ranges that I've seen. Some of them are from hedge funds, a lot of hedge funds, and then some of them are big data companies looking to deploy Kubernetes with big data, with the usage of big data, underneath, and setting up, their environment for that. And then some of them are AI, and then the other one is security aspect of deploying your containers and the actual cluster itself. And how does that look like doing the auditing of your containers and being able to pull in and see the performance of those containers as well too. So that's what I've seen the crazy ranges at.
Well, if you trip across that 500K job again, let me know, because I'd like to apply for that, especially if it's remote.
It goes right over.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
So, Tim, I'm a freelancer and most of the time an independent contractor. After taking the exam, what would be your next steps?
If you've gotten certified, certification, in my opinion, certification has two big benefits. One, that you have the knowledge, but now you can prove to others that you have that base knowledge. And since the exams are practical, it's not a brain dump. You really actually have to know something. The next step is really, in my opinion, it's building a network and a community. And that is, it's kind of old school that we've kind of come full circle to where it's who you know. And that is a process of reaching out to meetups, and which is actually one of the more successful ways of finding a decent job, is physically meeting people. And then you talk to them at a meetup where you're both excited about it, and they realize, God, this lady, she knows what she's talking about. And then they go back to their work and they mention to the boss, I met this lady. She really knows Kubernetes. The boss was like, great, hire her, let's do it. And that it's that kind of process that to get those gigs, most of them will come from some sort of personal recommendation. And a lot of that's just going to be in person. And other than in person, it's giving away stuff. So I know it seems antithetical, but if you can find a way to help other people. So sense documentation is really not great. If you notice that somebody has an issue, work with them to solve their issue. And what you'll find is you're going to learn more because you're solving their issue, but that's where you're going to get that reputation that people are going to notice. And they're going to say, gosh, this person really does know it. And to some extent, they're giving it away. It's almost that open source concept of, if you give it away, you'll get more in return because the community appreciates it. And that's how I would probably approach it. Is it helps if you have narrowed down your interests. So whether it's government work, startups are notorious for churning through people. But if you can get known in that world, the money people especially, they don't know the technology, nor do they want to know the technology. But if they can lean on you and you know what you're doing, they will come back to you over and over again and tell their friends. And that's the way to long-term employment. It also will probably lead to some long nights. In my own experience, somebody else had let down their agreement. They kind of ghosted when they were supposed to deliver. Right. I was asked, kind of just in desperation, can you do this? What can you do? We have to deliver it Wednesday. And I got it close enough in 5 days, that the customer was like, it could have been better, but we really appreciate it. Like they were happy enough, and that saved a lot of people's bacon. And what happened from that is everybody was like, okay. So then the next time something came up, that I was the first call. They were like, well, we know that you don't ghost on us. We know that you can do it under stressful situations, and we don't want to find somebody else. So let's just have you do it. And if you do that 2 or 3 times, it's a lot of work and some long weekends, but it's the personal relationship. Most of the gigs I've gotten have not been because of my videos or anonymous online stuff or resumes. I've gone through the .com and the .bomb era, and I went through 2008. So I've spent my time looking for new gigs, and none of it has ever come from that quote unquote traditional sending out resumes and the recruiter route and all that, all of it has been people that I knew 5 years ago. I get a random call and they reach out and they're like, hey, we needed somebody that can do this. And I remember you used to do this sort of stuff. Are you available? And that's literally how I've gotten every decent job since 2000.
And that's how we met, just plain on networking.
Yeah. And it's tough. If you were just coming out of high school or college or university and you don't have those relationships, it's very difficult. I didn't know about this. This is me looking back. Nobody told me this when I was getting started. But luckily I liked what I was doing. So I was very passionate about it. I did it as well as I possibly could, even when it wasn't convenient. And that does that leaves a mark. So do whatever it is you're going to do as best you possibly can and with passion. And eventually it's going to pay off. But, you have to be a decent person and you have to try. You have to get out there and try. But that networking will not pay off immediately because nobody knows you have a track record yet. For me, I didn't start getting those calls. It was, I had known that person 3 years before. And then finally they made it to a place that this lady made it to a place where she could make hiring decisions and called me and said, hey, I'd like you to talk to my boss and let's use you for this project. And that was years in the making. So it's sadly not fast, but it will pay off and pay dividends as you move forward.
Yeah, I liken it to planting seeds.
Oh,
you plant all your seeds and you wait for the harvest. And in the interim, you keep moving. You plant.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm borrowing that and using it as my own. So that's a great. That's a great way.
Have it. Yeah, you plant your seeds, and I mean, what was OSS? That was a couple of months ago, and you're here on the podcast.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah. Period. And then this will spawn something else. I mean, we're definitely going to get you on a class and offer that to our community. But I do want people to definitely hear that it's not a sprint. It's not going to happen overnight. It is a marathon and you have to keep at it. And if you get discouraged, don't be, because everybody's kind of on the same road.
Yeah, exactly. And the person who is passionate and willing to spend the extra time, with every passing day will shine that much more. Technology is like a gerbil wheel that you can't just, keep coasting. You have to keep running. And that wears almost everybody out, that you reinvent your knowledge every 18 months, Moore's Law.
Right.
A physician, an architect, a lawyer, they're not reinventing medicine every 18 months. I'm not saying they don't learn. It's just in this field, everything that you used to know is half worthless in 18 months.
Right. You have to keep learning. It's part of the field.
Yeah. And if you learn and share, that's when the people around you realize that you actually know what you're doing and you're not like them where they were just kind of coasting. And that's where your reputation builds.
I agree. I think the need to take what you learn and I say spend a week or two on it and then write not necessarily a blog, you can, but teach it to someone else. Like find someone who's in the field and just teach them what you learned in the last 2 weeks, or do a demo of what you learned in the last 2 weeks and just keep that as an iteration of knowledge, like building it out on YouTube or wherever you decide to put your content. But, just keeping like, okay, if I had to teach this to someone, what would be the steps for me to teach someone this?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll learn so much when they ask questions. When somebody says, okay, you said that, this is transient. What does that mean? And then you realize, well, I don't know. I kind of took the idea and put it in my head and I regurgitated it. I didn't actually understand it. And when you try to explain it, that's when and especially if the person is able to ask questions, that iteration of like, oh, I don't know. Let me go look, let me Google that for you. But it will fill out the areas that your assumptions that you didn't know. And you help other people, but you're really helping yourself fill in the base knowledge that you can actually use them. You're actually using the knowledge, even if it's not in a corporate sense.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
We're at our last question. Are you helping to develop anything on the Kubernetes roadmap, or is that just way too complicated for you right now?
My time is spent almost entirely developing courseware. I answer questions on the forum, and I do stuff like the videos that I mentioned. I do try to, when people reach out and they to me, again, this is talking about relationships. When people say, "Can you explain this?" or something like that, I spend time on that. So when somebody I know asks me, "Can you explain something?" that's when I'll spend time working on it. Whether it's here's a code, here's a YAML file that you could use, or this is what you're missing, and let me help debug that. Earlier on, I did try to spend a lot of time and effort working with the documentation teams to improve the online documentation because I found it really subpar. And I made several tickets, GitHub tickets on documentation on Kubernetes.io, and not one of them was worked on. And what I realized, they were all timing out. No activity after 90 days, and it got closed. And it's because the product changes a lot and nobody has a interest in having accurate documentation. And it was discouraging for me. I could have gone the extra step and, gone through the community process to get the ability to make the changes myself. But that's a lot compared to having that whole day job thing too. So I have made efforts to give back to the community. At some point, I will probably do that again. But right now, with the speed of change, most of my time is spent updating courseware and labs and forums and replying to people I know to help them get to the next step.
I agree. That's a lot. All right. So we're at the end of our podcast. This is where you get to do your shameless plug. Shout out anybody that has helped you along the way, dog, cat, person, star, astrology, anything that we might have left out along the way. I think we'll probably do a follow-up too. I think we'll do a deeper dive into Kubernetes from a federation standpoint, talking about that in another podcast. But shout yourself out. Don't be afraid. Here you go.
Okay. Well, thank you. I guess as far as a shameless plug, I would encourage everybody to take a look at the Linux Foundation in general. Their training opportunities are wide and varied. If you go to edX, we have free classes there, so take a look at those. There's a free class in Hyperledger, in OpenStack, and in Kubernetes. So take the free stuff. And then, of course, the classes I write for them, LFS 258 for Kubernetes with administration concept, and then a LFD 259, which is Kubernetes for developers to get started, and some of the other classes I teach. Of course, if I'm going to thank people, the good people of the Linux Foundation, my family for letting me work all day and all night in a dark, windowless room away from them. God, of course, for everything, and all the wonderful people like you guys who help get the word out there.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day, Tim, to chat with us.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I hope to do it again.
Thank you for tuning in to the Women in Linux podcast. Women in Linux is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization created to get women involved in the field of IT using Linux as a foundation. You can connect with Women in Linux through social media at Women in Linux on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. To join weekly meetups, go to meetups.com/Women in Linux. For more information and to connect with Women in Linux, go to www.womeninlinux.com.